48 hours after the stabbing death of an American woman in a shopping mall toilet, UAE police raid the house of an Emirati woman in her late 30s and take her into custody. The woman is suspected of stabbing to death 47-year-old Iboya Ryan on Monday.
An innocent American teacher is butchered in a public shopping mall, and suddenly we are forced to come to grips with non-military being targeted in Middle Eastern countries where we once thought we were safe. Add to that, we're still waiting to see what our government has in mind for the media strategy against people seeking to join groups like ISIS. Let's welcome to MidPoint resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, senior editor at Middle East Quarterly, and former Pentagon staff advisor for Middle Eastern issues, Michael Rubin. Michael, thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, thank you for having me here, Ed.
Michael, we are going to talk a little bit about this anti-ISIS media strategy here and where it is, but in light of the attack that we have seen now in the United Arab Emirates, is this just going to be the first of many to tell us, to send to us, that the different terrorist factions are there? They don't care if you're wearing the military uniform now. More than ever, it makes no difference where you go. If you're an American, you're a target, and you are susceptible to be killed by these terrorists.
That's absolutely correct, Ed. The irony here, however, is, though, that the United Arab Emirates and Abu Dhabi have been much more proactive on taking seriously the threat of this lone wolf radicalization. You know, some of the groups that President Obama meets with as Islamic advocacy groups, the government of the United Arab Emirates recently labeled them terrorist groups because they apologize and provide cover for Islamic radicalism, groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations. And so while this lone wolf attack occurred in Abu Dhabi, the irony is Abu Dhabi is taking this threat much more seriously than we are in Washington.
When we call them lone wolves, again, that conjures up this idea that it is one individual doing it one time and being very isolated. However, this individual also was accused of creating a very sophisticated bomb that was placed outside of a doctor's office, and this seemed to be a thought-out attack. Honestly now, Mike, are they really lone, or are they still in some way connected with the people who are feeding them information and getting them ready to be part of the terrorist groups?
Well, you're absolutely right there. The United States has long ignored the importance of incitement, and those who are inciting people to murder are just as culpable as those who are committing murder themselves. The fact of the matter is, first Al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State have been very, very sophisticated in putting how-to guides, how-to murder guides online, and these are getting downloaded. Inspire magazine, in the past, the United States has actually targeted and killed those responsible for some of these. Most importantly, Anwar al-Awlaki, the American preacher who was resident in Yemen, who was responsible for inciting the Fort Hood murders, or workplace violence, as the Obama administration says. But certainly, you're right. There is an irony in the term lone wolf because none of these are operating in solitude.
How insulting is it to use that phrase, workplace violence, when we see what happened at Fort Hood? Funny you mention that because I've heard that mentioned, but to some people, especially military people, and those who serve, it is a vile thing to use in light of what happened.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that's why if I were writing this, I would have put what I said in quotes. Obviously, I was being sarcastic when I said it. That said, we have the problem of the United States ignoring the fact that this is rooted in ideology. It's not rooted in grievance. If you want to know the biggest difference between a quote-unquote workplace violence incident and a terrorist attack, workplace violence might be rooted in a grievance, but terrorism is motivated by an ideology. And in the case of Fort Hood and so many other cases, it's rooted in an extreme interpretation of Islamic theology and an Islamist ideology.
Let's talk about this media strategy here. How do we in the American media specifically cover ISIS and talk about them without actually and effectively promoting them?
Well, you know, one of the biggest bugaboos I've always had when it comes to how the United States reports on terrorist groups, terrorism, and for that matter, the Islamic State, is simply the use of the passive voice. When you say a bomb goes off or 5 people were killed, that either says you don't know who did the killing or you're trying to hide from the audience those who were culpable in the killing. It all makes it so sanitary, and unfortunately, it's not sanitary. We need to wake up to the horror of what's going on. But at the same time, you know, what I wrote about recently was that the Islamic State has taken over radios, not just online, internet, Facebook, and so forth. They took over radio stations in Syria and Iraq, and they can now reach 40 million people outside the territory held by the Islamic State. They're preaching, and we're not responding to that. And when we forfeit our audience, you know, it's only going to get worse.
But Mike, can we really fight that? Because it's an ideology that we are talking about here. It is so deeply rooted in the lives of these people for generations that even if we were to reach 40 million people by radio or by internet, is there really honestly anything we could do to turn the tide and change their minds?
Well, you know, there's no magic formula, and certainly the strategy the State Department has been undertaking of, for example, taking these people to Saudi Arabia and giving them art therapy is nothing short of ridiculous. That said, one of the best strategies for taking on Islamic radicalism, and this is something which the Israelis have done very well, as have the Egyptians, is to use satire and ridicule. And the Egyptians, at the height of the Islamic insurgency in the 1990s, put out any numbers of TV satire showing the Islamists drinking. The Israelis have put out leaked phone calls, for example, of those who are encouraging suicide bombers, making sure that their own children don't become suicide bombers. It's that sort of hypocrisy which needs to be made clear to everyone in the potential ISIS audience.
Mike, I got about a minute left here, so let me take off what you just said here. Is it possible that satire and ridicule work, quite frankly, because the people that it's aimed at, who might be joining terrorist groups, who might become part of these insurgencies, are simply not that smart in the first place? So if you use intelligence and anything really smart, you're not going to reach them anyway because the head's too thick?
Well, you know, you got to do a variety of strategies. One is satire to delegitimize these folks. The U.S. Army in the past has actually distributed comic books because people who can't otherwise read can see some of that material. At the same time, there's any number of other preachers who find what the Islamic State preaches to be completely anathema. Well, let's make sure the Islamic State doesn't have a media monopoly and these other voices are heard. And if they're not heard, then those are the targets that you need to kill.
Well, when you consider that some of the ISIS recruits are currently saying that their iPods are no longer working when they go hang out with ISIS, you've really got to imagine that we're not dealing with the brightest bulb in the Christmas tree.
Well, that's absolutely right. At the best, we're dealing with the valedictorian of the summer school class.
There you go. It's exactly right. The commentary, again, is called Where's America's Anti-ISIS Media Strategy? An excellent article. Michael Rubin, thank you so much for joining us. If we don't talk before, have a wonderful holiday, you and your family.
Thank you, Ed. You too.
All right, break, and we're back with the Politichicks and the concern over Ted Cruz comments and that little thing we once knew as hope and change. And in telling it like it is later, the overreach on racism in both the Brown and Garner cases. It's all right here on MidPoint.